Welcome back to Everything We Know. The midterm election results are in across the country, and while there are still some races left to be decided, there are already some very clear takeaways. Now, you've probably heard the argument that America is becoming two very different countries: deep red states and deep blue states. And while that's not entirely true, America is becoming more polarized. Voters are less likely to vote across party lines, and gerrymandered districts have led to less and less competitive races. You've also probably heard the term voting with your feet, where voters move to a place that upholds their values or has policies that they align with. While this is actually a fundamental right recognized by the United Nations, it can have some pretty unintended consequences, especially in this era where it's happening more now than ever. If the minority simply packs up their bags and moves to a new state where they are the majority, then there's no incentive for the government in the former state to become more moderate. In fact, as voters move from one side of the aisle to another state entirely, the government from the former state will swing in the opposite direction. Once statewide races are no longer competitive, there's no effective representation for those in the minority who choose to stay where they are or can't leave. This is also bad for those on the moderate side of the majority because they become the new minority and lose their voice. Now, this is exactly what this election has shown. In the last 5 to 10 years, states like Florida, Texas, and Ohio have marketed themselves as conservative bastions and examples for Republicans around the country. States like Illinois, New York, and California have done the same on the Democratic side of the aisle. For voters who've been stuck in the minority for decades, these states represent where their elected leaders could espouse their beliefs. And so we've begun this mass exodus of Democrats and Republicans from states with governments that don't represent them into states that do represent them. They move to states with a big Republican majority or a big Democratic majority, further polarizing both the state that they left and their new home. So now, we do have states that are deep red and states that are deep blue, but what about the rest? There are a few in the middle, like Georgia and arguably Arizona, where the races are competitive and will probably stay competitive. Because in tight races, the margin between the minority and the majority is so small that it's reasonable for voters who don't get their way in one election to think they might win the next. There's not the same sense of hopelessness that comes from being a Democrat in Utah or a Republican in Connecticut. So you're less likely to move to another state. But if you do get a new job or retire, you're more likely to move to a state with people that tend to agree with you than one where they don't. So again, we've got red states and we've got blue states and we've got something in between. Why does that mean we need the Electoral College, and why can't we just use the popular vote to pick our president? Well, for that, we have to look at the original intent of the Republic and combine that with our analysis of political polarization today. Now, the United States is a republic of states. That's the same word that the rest of the world uses to refer to countries. And that's not an accident. When the authors of the Articles of the Confederation, which was the precursor to the Constitution, constructed the framework for the United States, they had a vision in mind that was a lot like the European Union is today. Several member states that govern themselves, but united under a single governing body to regulate relations between the states and have more sway in diplomatic relations with other countries around the world than any one of those states could have on their own. And that's what's known as a federalist system, and why we call the government in Washington, D.C. our federal government. But how would you determine who is part of the federal government, who ruled over the states, if you will? I mean, the purpose was to govern in the interest of the states, and the states were supposed to govern democratically in the interest of the people. So how would the federal government fulfill its role of representing the states? Well, the prevailing political party of the day, the Federalists, believed that each state could and should get the same number of voting representatives. It seemed fair to them because the federal government was supposed to represent the states, and it wouldn't make sense for a state to even remain in the Union if they kept getting outvoted by a state with a little more legislative power than they had. On the other hand, the anti-federalists, and yes, that is a real word, and the second largest political party at the time, they believed that the federal government should have proportional representation, so that states with more people would have more control over the decisions that the federal government made, because they were home to more of the people that those policies would affect than the smaller states. So, in typical American fashion, they compromised. I know that doesn't sound like typical American fashion today, but there were a lot of compromises in the Constitution and in the Articles of the Confederation. They did both. They set up two chambers in their legislative body. The Senate was filled with two representatives from every state, just the way the Federalists wanted, and the House of Representatives was proportional to the population in each state. So states like Virginia had more representatives than states like Rhode Island. At the time, senators were hand-selected by the state governors and state legislatures to represent the interests of the state. That later changed. And at the time, America was also very polarized. The original colonies were religiously and culturally distinct from one another. A colony for Quakers, one for Anglicans, one for Dutch, one for English, etc. So this Federalist system kind of made sense because everyone was ruling themselves in these little colonies that would become essentially states. It also meant that the executive branch had to serve a unique collage of different societies. And again, a quasi-federalist system prevailed. Each state was granted a number of votes for the president as the chief executive, somewhat proportional to the number of people living in the state. But so that small states didn't get outvoted by a huge margin, every state also had an equal number of extra votes, if you will. So one for every representative and one for every senator. Meaning, at a minimum, a state would have one representative and two senators, so they would have a minimum of 3 electoral votes. And that's a system that we still use to this day. Now, the president's intended job has always been to serve the states and to work on their behalf. Even if one state represented the majority of the country, they still shouldn't get to decide what happens to all of the other states. But they should probably have more say with a state than, one that had only 1% of the population, right? That's where the Electoral College comes in as another form of compromise. The states choose the president because the president is supposed to serve the state's interests. And the voting power of each state is weighted based on their population. Now, it's not a perfect system, but it serves the interests of the states, the intended purpose of the federal government. Now, let's wrap up and tie it all together. With political polarization leading millions of Americans to move to states that are more representative of their views, states are again becoming culturally and politically distinct. We have solid blue states, we have solid red states, and we've got a few in between. But in order to represent the interests of these distinct states, we need a voting system that upholds the original purpose of the presidency. And that is where the Electoral College comes in. If you like that quick video essay, follow us on this channel and let me know what you think down in the comments below. I'm sure there are a lot of arguments that I didn't make in favor of the Electoral College and a lot of arguments that you can make against it. I tried to go back and really make an argument that I have not seen out here on YouTube in a while, or on Rumble if you're watching this on Rumble or any of our other social media. Let me know down in the comments below. We also have links to follow us on Twitter. We're pretty active over there as well. Thank you so much, and have a great day.